What's the difference between how we might approach a stranger versus a friend about any given topic? With a friend, we already have a pretty good idea of how the conversation might go. We already have some idea of how our dynamic usually plays out. We have an idea of their sensitivities and their frustrations versus a stranger who's a pretty blank slate. The conversation could veer off in so many different directions. But how do we bridge that gap and make it easier for us to talk to strangers about any given topic? The key is rapport. Rapport is like a lubricant in the wheels of conversation. It makes it easier for both parties to engage with each other and to flow without stoking too much frustration, even when the topic is one that is more sensitive. In his book, How to Have Impossible Conversations by Peter Boghossian, he outlines 10 ways in which we can go about improving rapport. And rapport is not something that is only reserved for strangers. We can always use it to improve our conversations with people we already know. The first way he talks about is to build rapport immediately. Don't save rapport building for after a frustrating conversation. Do it at the beginning. It makes any subsequent conversations more easier to have. And do it especially when there is a controversial issue that is impending. The second way is to ask rapport building questions. These are pretty simple small talk type of questions, like how are you? It's pretty hot today. What are your hobbies? But try to focus it on the person that you're talking to instead of consuming the conversation with your own opinions. It puts them in a more accepting frame of mind, which makes it easier to have more difficult conversations. The next is to find common ground. This is not too difficult if you are good at small talk, but regardless of your skill level, it's all about being intentional about listening to what it is that your partner is saying, trying to empathize with whatever they're saying, trying to understand where they're saying, showing a keen interest and curiosity. And a lot of the times you can usually find something that you both share, whether it's a movie that you both enjoy or a genre of movies, a type of music. Even if there is no commonality, you can always use curiosity as a substitute for that. There's this saying that people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. Knowing how much you care does not simply mean knowing that you care about the topic at hand. So if it's a sensitive topic, they don't care how much you know about the topic. And it also doesn't necessarily mean that you care about the person, although that is important. The most important thing is to show that you care about the person's values as well. And this is why it's so important to find that common ground. That common ground is not just finding the hobbies that you both share or finding the political party or whatever it is that you both share, but finding the deeper values that are at play in those common grounds. These are things that you can always anchor yourself to whenever the conversation starts to feel a little heated or frustrating. The next is do not parallel talk. This is something that I have been guilty of so many times and I'm just now starting to get better at. Parallel talk is when someone says something like, oh, I visited Indonesia recently and you've been to Indonesia before, so before you know it, you take over the conversation with your experiences in Indonesia, all the things you learned about Indonesia, instead of giving your partner that space to talk about what it was that they experienced in Indonesia. This is just one example, but I'm sure you can think of many different occasions where someone or yourself has parallel talked. The key in these situations is to first allow your partner to finish their thoughts and, if necessary, to support what they're saying based on your experience. Only after that, only after giving them an opportunity to express their opinions and ideas about whatever it is or experiences, is it the right time to then go in and talk about yours? And maybe then you can even go ahead and find common ground with that. The next is to invest in relationships independent of the conversation itself. When you're having difficult conversations about a topic, it's often very easy for us to feel like the relationship is held up by the thread of that particular conversation, right? It's easy, especially when it's something that is near and dear to our hearts, to feel as though because the person doesn't agree with us, or because the person does not see eye to eye with us, that they must not be a good friend or that they must be a shitty person, especially if we don't know the person. But it's very important for us to delineate between friendships and opinions. These are two things that do not necessarily need to be inextricably linked. We can have friendships with people that we disagree with. And in fact, we can have some of the best friendships with them. We can have some of the most enlightening friendships with them because we have someone we trust, even if we don't see eye to eye on, who we can always fall back to if we want to understand the other side of something that we still might not agree with. The next on the list is to only engage in substantive conversations if you and your partner have the time. This is something that I learned from my philosophy class back in the day, which was actually about 3 hours long, but the time flew by so fast because of the types of conversations we had, and it always felt like my teacher was having the last word. You know, he was not the type to let me to end on the last note. He was the type to really want to make sure that his opinion was the last one standing, even if there was a disagreement about it. And this made me realize that instead of trying to get to the bottom of things in such settings where there's an obvious time limitation, to just allow the person to express their opinions and to just be more curious about where it is that they're coming from. Because if the conversation is going to be restricted because of those time constraints, then the last thing you want is another layer of frustration because your partner felt as though they weren't heard simply because there wasn't enough time or something. So it's best to just stay away from those conversations when it is obvious that there is not enough time to begin with. 6 on the list is be ready to change the topic. If you start to get into a heated conversation, fall back on the common ground, fall back on the hobbies, fall back on anything that you noticed during your rapport building phase that piqued your partner's interest or that you saw some sort of passion come through. And this can often redirect the conversation towards more amicable grounds. The next is to avoid callouts except when it is very, very necessary. This is something that a lot of people, especially in this day and age, if we're going to admit it, are guilty of. We have so much shaming for people having opinions that were once considered very common. This is something that very easily kills rapport, something that we have to be more cognizant about. If we feel particularly sensitive to these things, we should always try to remember that the point of rapport building is not to attack the other person. It's not to get into sensitive topics. It's simply to listen to where that person is coming from. And then if we want to engage further, we're doing that knowing that we already have a solid foundation. If we feel we have a solid foundation and we start to carry on with a more substantive conversation, and we happen to misjudge their tolerance or our tolerance towards one thing or the other, it's best to just redirect, right? It's best to do that than to let the conversation to keep spiraling out of control. The next is to be courteous. These are the common things, the things we learned ever since we were young. Say thank you, say please. It goes such a long way in letting your partner, the party that you're talking to feel respected and heard. I think this is pretty self-explanatory, but I also think that a lot of the times our attachment to some agenda, some topic or the other tends to get in the way of common courtesy. The last is to listen more and talk less. Some people, it's easier to do this than others. Sometimes it might feel as though we are literally carrying the conversation, and even if we gave them a chance to talk, they're not going to say much. In those situations, it's best to just keep practicing our small talk skills and trying to figure out what it is that excites them, so to speak, what it is that we can use to try to get them talking. Or we can just, try to, if all they care about is to hear our thoughts, then, that's just how the dynamic shapes out to be. But if the person is someone who likes to talk as much or even more, we should try to respect that, and we should try to give them that courtesy of given their opinions a fair hearing. We should allow them to speak. We should not interrupt. We should be more curious than lecturing in our own speaking. I would love to hear what you think about these ideas. Are you guilty of some of these things? Have you communicated with other people who are guilty of them? How did you go about handling it? Do you think these ideas are effective? I would love for you to share your thoughts in the comments. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video.